Hi, I'm John Fitzgerald and welcome to Custodian TV and welcome to 2012. And the good news is it didn't start with any bad news. I remember being away for a lot of January last year and just reading a lot of the press about the terrible floods and then further natural disasters. Good news, it has started with good news. Solve the European debt crisis. And there's two interesting things about this. One is the first amount of auction monies that they auctioned off, and two, the second amount that they're auctioning off in February, and now Greece and various other economies there have come into line. What is really interesting though is that there's a lot of negative press about what's going on in Europe, but what doesn't get a lot of the press is what's going on around the rest of the world. And that's very interesting because you've got China growing at 8.5%, India growing at 7%, Africa growing at 5.5%, and the USA back to growth at 2.8%. And the USA is a very interesting story. I was over in the USA just 3-4 weeks ago. Front of Time magazine, Warren Buffett, demographics is destiny. And what he's referring to is that the USA's unemployment's fallen from 9.1 to 8.5%. Their building starts, that is the amount of houses that they're building, back up to 685,000 a year. And as he said, when that reaches 1 million, it's going up by 10 to 20% per annum, unemployment will come down significantly. Retail sales are up and things are actually moving there. There's over 7,000 banks in America. They're anxious to do a little bit of business, and that's good news for Australia, because what's happening at home is a tale of almost two economies. We've got not just the mining economy, but we've got the low end and the high end. And what's driving a lot of these things is our population growth. Australian population growth is up to nearly 1 million people every 26 months. That's nearly 500,000 a year. In fact, for 2011, we hit 485,000, and that is a record in the history of Australia. That is amazing. And as Buffett says, demographics is destiny. Another 500,000 Australians, and we're lucky to build 130,000, 140,000 houses. The maths just don't add up. And what it leads to is that inevitable property boom that I've been talking about that'll start sometime in 2012 and certainly roll into 2013, 2014. The only thing stopping the full boom is actually banking and finance. And when I talk about that tale of two economies, the GFC was a global financial crisis. The banks essentially ran out of money and the Australian banks panicked, tightened up significantly. We had a credit squeeze. In America, they call it the Great Recession, but they're well out of recession with their 2.8% growth. The Australian banks clamoured for funds and stopped lending money to a lot of commercial developers, a lot of businesses, and a lot of high-end properties. And now we see in the property market the high end coming down while the low end is actually going up. Custodian houses grew through 2011, yet the median house price dropped by somewhere between 8 and 9%, depending on what city you're in. That's very, very interesting news. And we've got real good data and clients now. We're seeing the growth in their properties. And furthermore, we're seeing the banks begin to lend more. They're back to 95% LVRs. That is, they're anxious to get into that space. And the headline, as you probably well know, is that there are now international banks looking at getting into our space, I should say our housing space. The ICBC Bank of China announced they're going to set up 70 branches in Sydney and Melbourne. And the Mitsubishi Bank and the other Japanese banks looking at coming to our market. Now, these banks, let me tell you the scale of this, are bigger than all of our banks put together. And the real attractiveness is that Australia has the highest interest rates in the world. And to put that on scale for you, the ECB, the European Central Bank, are auctioning off nearly $500 billion of euro next month, are auctioning that off at 1%. So then that can be on lent, etc., etc. The Japanese banks are lucky to get 1.5%, 2% on their money. So when they look at Australia and maybe setting up here and being able to lend into housing at maybe 4 or 5%, imagine how much of the market they could capture. The total debt on Australian housing is only $1 trillion. The total value of Australian housing is $4.5 trillion. So these are real compelling numbers, and you can expect some real pickup in that competitiveness. And what's going to drive that is, as you well know, the Reserve Bank have flagged, yes, we're going to reduce interest rates. We want to actually get things going. An amazing time in 2012, and as I said in 2011, I forecast we're going to see the start of this boom as the world comes out of recession, Europe, everyone solves its crisis, and what's going to drive it is going to be our housing, because the numbers with nearly 500,000 population growth and us building barely 120, 130, maybe 40,000 homes, the numbers just aren't adding up. Add to that competition in the banking sector, you've got yourself a full-blown boom, and that's what we've prepared ourselves for. We're also starting 2012 with what I believe is a fantastic initiative. This is following our kickstarts. We're setting up Team Wealth Builders, and this is a weekly interactive session where I'm going to be doing a team talk. You can log in, listen in, you can be on Twitter, blog, whatever way, whatever's your fancy from a social media perspective, or listen to me on the phone. And what I'm going to be talking about, the 3 principles of becoming a millionaire, a multi-millionaire. The next 4 or 5 years are going to be the most important in Australian history. What's going to determine your success? Your environment. Number 1, you need to build that environment around you that allows you to be successful, and I'm going to highlight that. Number 2 is managing your cash flow and managing your income. That is getting income growth. And number 3 is momentum, the real key to success. If you're standing still, you're going backwards. And I'll finish with this quote. Jim Collins, who wrote Good to Great and various other great business books, surveyed nearly 6,000 years of corporate history to identify the real top performers in each of their classes. He brought it down to the one single factor that really did highlight real success from mediocrity: discipline. And that's what the Team Talk's going to be about. Hey, thanks for listening to me today.